Hello, senior scholars. Tom Mandeville back for our last lecture, How Time Flies. But as I mentioned last week, we're going to focus in on the life of Benedict Arnold, patriot and traitor. So, what we'll do first, and you'll be able to follow along with, I've made up a chronology of the life of Benedict Arnold, modeled after our other handouts that I've made up. So what we're going to do is, a lot of it in the beginning here is going to be review. Because if you remember, in the very first lecture, I talked a bit about Arnold's life and Ethan Allen's life. And then we're going to review Arnold's heroic activities in the North Country that we've already covered, but it's good to have all this in mind when we start to examine why he was a traitor. So, starting out with our chronology that you'll be able to download and print if you choose to. Benedict Arnold was born on January 14th, 1741, to Benedict Arnold II and his wife, Hannah Waterman King, in Norwich, Connecticut. They were a relatively well-off family. His father was a successful businessman. His mother also came from money. So during his younger life, Arnold received a private school education. And during Arnold's childhood, though, tragedy struck the family when three of his brothers and sisters, 3 out of the 4, died of yellow fever, which was a horrible disease that racked the Western Hemisphere. And it's likely, due to these losses, that his father began to heavily drink, which really affected the family forward. At age 16, Arnold served a short apprenticeship as an apothecary, and then he decided to enlist in the Connecticut militia to fight the French for the British during the French and Indian War. Most of his service was in upstate New York, and during this time, his mother passed away in 1759, which broke his heart. He was really, really close to his mother. And then his father passed away in 1761. This left Arnold and his only sister, Hannah, who he then, obviously took responsibility for. And in 1762, he returns to New Haven and starts his own apothecary shop. Hannah served as his assistant in this business, and they also got into selling books, jewelry, artwork, and he became more successful as time went by sailing in his own ships he acquired down to the West Indies to carry on trade, and also sailing north to Montreal and Quebec, trading horses. In 1764, Arnold joined the radical revolutionary group that originally formed in Boston, the Sons of Liberty, that many of you may have heard of before, because he had already started participating in smuggling efforts and avoiding to pay taxes and tariffs to the British government. So this is really where he gets his first taste for rebellion. In Boston, Sam Adams, Paul Revere are notable Sons of Liberty that you probably heard of before. In 1767, Arnold will marry for the first time to Margaret Mansfield, who is the daughter of the sheriff of New Haven, Connecticut, and they had 3 sons together. Unfortunately, Margaret will pass away in June of 1775. In December of 1773, around the same time as the Boston Tea Party took place, which was an event that was led by the Sons of Liberty in Boston. Arnold decided to form a militia of around 58 men in his hometown of New Haven, and they were called the Governor's Foot Guards, commanded by Arnold. Then, as we know, his first actions in the Revolutionary War will take place on May 10th, when he and Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys capture Fort Ticonderoga. Then, in September of 1775, Benedict Arnold and Captain Daniel Morgan and 1,100 men will set sail from Newburyport, Massachusetts, to the Kennebec River, where they'll start their grueling trek through the woods of Maine and Quebec, with a destination of Quebec City, which the Americans have decided to attempt to capture from the British that we covered. On December 31st, 1775, Generals Arnold and Montgomery will combine their forces and attack Quebec City. And as we know, Montgomery was killed in action, Arnold was wounded, and Captain Morgan was captured by British forces led by Sir Guy Carleton. So, next, on the next page, reviewing more of what we've already covered, but just to refresh your memories, General Wooster will arrive in Quebec from Montreal, and they'll kind of switch positions. Arnold, who's still recovering from that gun wound to his leg, will take Wooster's place and be the commander of American forces in Montreal, which they still hold by this point. Then, June to July 76 will be the abandonment of Canada by the Americans and their invasionary forces. Now, obviously, we covered a lot of the things that happened in that retreat, but the big deal is on June 15th, Arnold will abandon Montreal. Then by June 20th, he'll abandon the open-air hospital at Illinois, and Arnold will finally be the last group out of Canada onto Lake Champlain and return the remaining forces to Crown Point. Now, the next big effort by Arnold, obviously, is in the summer and early fall of 76, following the commands of George Washington and Gates. He'll oversee the building of what we like to call America's First Navy at Skenesboro. And he'll put together this Navy to stop what everyone knows is going to happen due to reconnaissance reports, an invasion by sea by Guy Carleton and the British Navy out of the Richelieu River. So Arnold puts together this fleet, trains foot soldiers to be sailors, does maneuvers on the lake, and prepares to engage Carleton and his superior navy. And as we covered in detail, that will happen starting on October 11th in the Battle of Valcour. And we know that Arnold and his fleet will suffer heavy casualties in that battle, being outgunned and outmanned by the British. And when nightfall comes on the 11th, Arnold pulls off that miraculous escape from the Straits of Valcour and sails south in the night. The next morning, after the fog lifted, Carleton and the British were quite surprised to see that Arnold had disappeared, and they finally figure out they had sailed south, and Arnold had stopped at near Schuyler Island to the south to assess damage and try to repair some of his ships. He had to abandon the Jersey and the Spitfire had already sunk. The next morning, on October 13th, the British will catch up with the retreating fleet of Arnold's, and they'll initially surround the Washington. She'll surrender. Arnold aboard the Roll Galley Congress and 4 of the gunboats lagging behind will ultimately be scuttled at Ferris Bay near Panton, Vermont, and Arnold and his crew will escape down to Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. And that will serve as a very important delay to Carleton's invasion, which we already covered will force him to abandon the invasion in 76 and go back and winter in Saint Jean, Quebec. Now, on the next big action that'll take place as far as Arnold is concerned, he'll be part originally of Philip Schuyler's army that is at the mouth or at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson River in the Sprouts that we talked about last class. General Gates, by August 23rd, 77, had taken over command of the Northern Department from General Philip Schuyler, and he will order Arnold and his army to go west on the Mohawk and reinforce American forces who were under siege by the British and Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger's army at Fort Stanwix. Just the word of Arnold's force approaching will cause St. Ledger and his army to evacuate and head back to Canada ultimately. So then on August 31st, 77, Arnold will return to Van Slyke Island with additional forces, Leonard's Brigade, and most importantly, Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. Now, as we mentioned before, just in last class, Arnold will be an integral part of the 2 battles at Saratoga. And he'll be fight very bravely in the first battle in September at Freeman's Farm. Then he'll, after getting into an argument with General Gates over the report he sent about the Battle of Freeman's Farm to the Continental Congress, he will be disciplined by Gates. He'll be told to stay in his tent until he can get to Philadelphia to join George Washington. But on that fateful day in October, during the battles of the Barbers Wheatfield, Balcarres, and Bremen Redoubt, Arnold cannot stand hearing his men in action, will burst out of his tent and lead them to glorious victory at the Bremen Redoubt. Arnold is wounded again in the same leg as he was wounded in Quebec, and this wound will harm his ability to lead as a military leader for the rest of his life. But Arnold was a hero at Saratoga, but he's still in this big argument with General Gates. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about, before we get into what happens to Arnold after Saratoga, the tensions between General Gates and General Washington that I've been hinting at before, but really part of Arnold's big problem, which some historians argue obviously led him to make the horrible decision to betray his country later on, is being caught up in this competition between General Horatio Gates and General George Washington over who should command the Continental Army. Now, besides this being caught in the middle of this, because Arnold was totally and completely loyal to General Washington, and quite frankly, really couldn't stand General Gates. In previous things that had happened, he'd been overlooked for promotions by the Continental Congress. Others that probably shouldn't have been promoted were promoted before him, and so forth. So he already had a bad taste in his mouth when it came to how the Continental Army was operating. And in all these cases, George Washington always defended Benedict Arnold because he knew how valuable he was and what a great field general he was. So tensions immediately arose between General Washington and General Gates right after Saratoga. And there's a couple different terms to use for this animosity between the two, and Gates' attempt to seize command as commander-in-chief, the position that Washington held over the Continental Army, dating all the way back to 1775, when the Second Continental Congress had met in May and granted him that position. One is known as the Newberg Conspiracy, where Continental Army officers were challenging the authority of the Continental Congress because they were mad about not being paid. And a lot of this was blamed on Washington, especially by Gates. But the big one is known as the Conway Cabal, which was a group of military officers who were attempting to remove Washington from command of the Continental Army and replace him with their ally, Major General Horatio Gates. The leader of this movement was Brigadier General Thomas Conway, who was an Irish member of the French Army who was under the command of a brigade in Washington's army. Conway was very critical of Washington's performance at the Battle of Brandywine, and he was trying to play up himself as being the real military genius and hero there. Similar to Gates taking all the credit from Arnold at Saratoga, when Gates basically did nothing on the battlefield. So, shortly after Brandywine, Conway had wrote to the Continental Congress requesting a promotion. General Washington protested Conway's promotion, and he did not receive it, which further irritated Conway. Then in October of 1777, after Saratoga, Conway starts to correspond with Gates, encouraging him to seize the leadership of the Continental Army. And in all these correspondence between Gates and General Conway, which the University of Michigan's Clements Library has all these letters, the two of them referred to General Washington in code. So in case any of these letters were intercepted, they wouldn't know what they're supposedly talking about. And they always referred to him as, quote unquote, the weak general. Well, one of Gates's top men, Colonel James Wilkinson, who you may have heard of before, Wilkinson will be a career military man, and the guy can't be trusted as far as you can throw him. Some of you may have heard of him being involved with Aaron Burr in Aaron Burr's harebrained scheme to potentially try to seize control of the Louisiana Territory after killing Hamilton in a duel. Wilkinson was a real piece of work. Wilkinson was Gates' aide to camp. And to give you an idea of the importance of that position, that's the same position that Alexander Hamilton served to George Washington. So it's like your right-hand man, your most trusted underling officer. Wilkinson had spilled the beans while drinking one night on this, what becomes known as the Conway Cabal. And everybody who heard him that night, who were not necessarily allies of Gates, end up sending the word back to Washington that he better watch his back. So Washington tells Conway, I know what you're trying to do. So on November 14th, 1777, Conway offered his resignation to Congress. But instead of accepting his resignation, they created a new position for him, the Inspector General of the Army, and the rank of Major General. In addition, they created a board of war to oversee Washington with some members of the Continental Congress, including Samuel Adams and Richard Henry Lighthorse Lee. And they also appointed Gates to preside over this commission. So Gates was in cahoots with some major members of the Continental Army. But by the time January of 1778 comes around, the so-called Conway Cabal will collapse after Washington spills the beans to the Continental Congress and tells them there's a group of letters between these two, and they refer to me, and they're conspiring against me, but they refer to me as the weak general. When Gates and Conway refused to hand over the so-called weak general letters to the Continental Congress, that will be the end of any attempt by Gates to overtake Washington as commander, because now the Continental Congress really knows what's going on. So, in the spring of 1778, after this is all discovered, Gates will return to field command in the north, controlling troops in New York and Massachusetts. Gates will then later, and Washington will remain commander-in-chief. Gates will then later take command of the Southern Army in South Carolina in July of 1780. And Gates will march towards British troops who were stationed in Camden, South Carolina. And despite the fact that he knew he was outnumbered and his men were running low on supplies, the Battle of Camden took place on August 16th, 1780. The Battle of Camden was one of the largest defeats that American troops had ever suffered during the Revolution. And Gates, after he figured out his troops had started a retreat, runs like a coward. Gates retreats 200 miles from the scene in 3 days, and accused of an act of cowardness, Gates was removed from command in October of 1780. Now, Congress will briefly reinstate Gates into the Army in the summer of 1782, and remember, the fighting is over in the Revolutionary War because Yorktown occurred in October of 1781. Gates will finally leave the Army in 1783. In 1790, Gates will sell his Virginia plantation, free his slaves, which you got to hand it to him for doing, and he bought an estate in New York called Rose Hill Farm. He'll end up serving one term in the New York State Legislature in 1800 to 1801, and then Gates will pass away on April 10th, 1806. So that's the animosity between Washington and Gates that Arnold gets caught smack dab in the middle of, which is just going to magnify his problems with the high command of the American Army. Not Washington, but the others, and especially the Continental Congress. So I'm going to take a break now. We'll pick up with Arnold taking command of Philadelphia when I come back after getting a drink of water and taking a break here. So I'll talk to you soon. Bye.